A few things about guilt and shame that have to do with both culture, society, multi-generational stuff that a lot of people don't think about very often. One of the ways that guilt and shame intertwine and then get plastered all over someone is, say you repeatedly engage in behavior that's guilty type behavior, like maybe you repeatedly are taking something from a sibling that doesn't belong to you, but it belongs to them, but by taking it away and trashing it, you know, you're acting out on some anger, usually about something else, but when you're a kid, who knows all this stuff? Or you're, maybe you're the bully at school, okay? Maybe you're, of course these days we sort of celebrate bullies. That's a whole other insanity. But the bottom line is you repeatedly engage in guilty behavior, and after a while people start telling you you're a bad person. Our criminal justice system, for example, if you have a first offense, they let you off pretty easy because they figure, well, everybody's entitled to one mistake. And if you think about the whole guilt paradigm where it's like, oh, I messed up, I don't ever want to mess up again, I apologize, and it literally changes your belief system and your behavior such that you probably won't do the same thing again. Unless you don't care. And then after you've done the same thing a few times, you become that flawed person. And all the shame that goes along with it. If you're involved in the justice system and you have more than one or two things, you know, that start popping up as a record, repeat offender, well then obviously you are a flawed person. That's why we lock people up who do certain repeat offenses, because we know that we can predict that they're not safe to leave out on the streets in terms of other people. Now, and then I want to be very clear that in terms of, because I've worked with offender populations most of my life, I think that people who repeatedly offend in violent crimes should be locked up. I want to be very clear about that, because I don't know if they can be rehabilitated over the long term until there are some rather major life changes, most of which they aren't going to learn in prison because our prison system is a disaster. That's a whole other conversation. But family stuff, for example, my mother had a lot of shame about being a bastard, even though she had no guilt about it because it wasn't her fault. Okay, one of the things, ironically, that cemented their marriage and made it last 53 years was my father had shame because he didn't know the real origins of his father or his family name or any of those kinds of issues. And years later, after everybody died, including my father, I hired a genealogist and did some research and discovered that the romanticized story that my grandmother had given my father about how his parents met at the Adriatic and fell madly in love and eloped, and then he died of pneumonia because he gave his coat to a beggar leaving the opera, and he was such a kind and loving and generous man, and I could never fall in love with another man again because your father and I were so much in love. And the complete BS. Complete. And one of the reasons I want to talk about this is because parents often will give their children romanticized versions of what really happened because, you know, they want the kid to have a better start than whatever was reality. You know, the reality was, after a lot of research, that my grandmother grew up in orphanages. She was probably a mail-order bride because that's how a lot of unwanted girls came to America. The unwanted boys usually managed to work their way across on a steamer, but the girls didn't have that option, so they would sign themselves on as mail-order brides and come to this country ostensibly to marry some guy. But the marriage, a lot of the time, the marriage did not take place. Either they lived together a little while and then split up, or maybe they lived together a little longer but eventually split up. And this is apparently what happened with Mr. Vremsack, Louis Vremsack Sr., and my grandmother, Marie Bolte. She left him, moved to Tampa, Florida, told my father his father was dead, told him the whole romanticized story, lived with Columbus Guerin for 9 months so she could become Marie Guerin. I don't know how much she may have convinced my father that Edward V. Guerin sounded more American than Louis Bremsack, but I do know in the early 60s my father had to go to New York City and do a legal name change because he had worked all of his life as Edward V. Guerin under Social Security, but Edward V. Guerin had never been born. Louis Bremsack was born. So he never quite believed her story either because we could never find a death certificate for Louis Bremsack. Well, it turns out, and this one just says, talk about life is filled with irony. It turns out Louis left New York around 1912. He stopped in Philadelphia where he remarried and actually did marry a woman. And the two of them moved to Los Angeles in the 1920s, where he spent his whole life, was a member of the Elks Club of Santa Barbara, and yes, just 3 weeks ago, August of 2012, I found where he was buried out in Forest Lawn, Glendale, in the Acacia Gardens. So I find it ironic. I've lived here in LA almost 30 years, so what kind of genetic memory was going on there, or fate, or God, or all of the above? But here I am in Los Angeles, just like my grandfather. And so life is filled with irony. But my father had a lot of shame about the fact that he didn't really know anything about his father, and he blamed himself. And he, you know, if I'd had a father, I would have loved him. So of course he blamed his two sons too whenever we disappointed him. So we had the shame of not being worthy because, well, he never had a father, and if he'd had a father, he would have been obedient, and he would have loved him, and all of this, and blah, 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 blah. So this whole shame and guilt thing was rampant 100 years ago in this culture. And it carries down multi-generationally in terms of how people learn to deal with issues. And you'd like to think, oh, well, it's 100 years, we don't do things that way anymore. But we still have a very high divorce rate. We still have children who barely know one parent because the other parent took off with them. And we still have children who may not know anything about a parent at all. We have children who are the descendants of Gulf War veterans who died in the Gulf War. I mean, the list goes on in terms of this family diaspora, this family separation, where children grow up in single-parent homes or in homes where one of their parents is kind of a myth they hear about occasionally, and often not in the most flattering of terms. And one of the favorite expressions that parents love to use, single parents, is, "You're just like your father," or "You're just like your mother." I never met him. I don't even know what that means. It doesn't matter. The bottom line is, you're just not good enough. And of course the subliminal messages, and I got rid of them, you could be next. And then we wonder why we have so many kids disobedient and acting out at school and being pumped Ritalin and labeled A.D.H.D. and all that stuff. Because we don't talk about these other issues that a lot of us are dealing with, because we have the guilt and the shame and the don't feel, don't talk about it, no matter what. Now here's where I'm going to see if my studio audience has been listening. Because remember, we're only as sick as
secrets.
We're only as sick as our secrets, the things we don't talk about. And I tell this to clients all the time. The stuff your family did not talk about is far more important than what they did talk about. Because the stuff they didn't talk about is where all of this stuff is buried. And you're still living it. You just don't know. It's like the smell is in your life coming up out of the ground, but you don't know what's buried in there. You just know something's not right, and I'm living it, and I'm feeling it.